I'll mute myself for your sake.
Thank you. Stanley has something to say about that. That's great. Well, we're so excited, and I know that did take a little bit of our time, and George mentioned that, but I think it's important because I think there's something about trees that every single person can really connect with and have connected with. And I think that's part of why this book, The Hidden Life of Trees, has been so very successful, a surprise success. Before we get deep into the conversation about the book, I just want to go over what the first class is going to be, which is really looking at the author. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about Peter Wohlleben and who he is and where he comes from, the context in which the book was written. And then we'll spend the rest of our time really discussing the book and some topics around it, including why this book is so successful right now, what's the forces behind that, what's happening in our general culture that's making this book and books like this very successful. We will talk about anthropomorphism, which is one of the critiques of the book, is that it's really takes a human perspective on a tree, and what's the benefit of that and what's the cost of that? And then just general feedback, what people thought, what their experiences, what their questions were. And I'll let Jeremy explain what class 2 will be. So Jeremy.
Sure, thanks, Susie. So we need to recognize, as we're talking about this book, that there's been a tremendous sort of critical review from the scientific community concerned about anthropomorphism and other components of this book and some of the other work that the author's been working on. So next week we'll take some of the examples from chapters. He sort of divides up stories within chapters about trees and talk about how he presents it, and then look at how the scientific community would typically present this. And it's hopefully no less magical, but maybe from a different perspective. Let's put it that way.
Thanks, Jeremy. Does anybody?
We'll go through a series of chapters that way. Not all of them by any means, but.
Great. Does anybody have any questions about the outline of the class? All right, so I think we'll start off with, I'm going to share my screen and just do a very quick kind of biography of Peter and what his life has been, and then we'll get into discussing it. So let me just make sure I can share my screen. Let's just talk about Peter Wohlleben. He's a fellow was born in 1964 in Germany. So he's German. The book was first published in German. He was educated as a forester. He has his degree from, I think, Rottenburg or one of those universities. And then he went on and went on further and has what we would consider a master's degree. And he spent the first 20 years of his life as a civil servant in the German Forestry Commission. And it was during those times that he worked kind of harvesting trees and managing forests that he began to develop a really kind of different view of how we might be working with forests. So he wanted to pursue what he considered to be a less invasive and more sustainable way and more ecologically balanced way of managing forests. And so he left his job as a civil servant, and he was actually able to convince a municipal forest in the town that he lives near, which is Hummel, Germany, and that is the actual place where they make the Hummel figurines, to manage their forest and kind of open a ecological experiences there. So you can go and actually hike in the forest with him and learn from him and learn from the people that he's training. He'll come to your forest in Germany and help other municipalities kind of find ways to manage the land differently. He stopped using logging trucks and started using horses. He really kind of manages the forest with a hands-off perspective. And during this whole time, he also began to write books. And this is from an interview from the New York Times. So, and this is, I'll send that to you, but you can sort of see, it says he took a chance, and it was really, he had to convince the municipality to do this. He considered moving to Switzerland with his family as 2 children and a wife, to kind of try this different way of managing land. But the town that he had been working from eventually hired him. And the forest went, as you can see in the quote, loss for profit, to actually making more money while letting the woods grow wilder without harvesting so much woods. And also, I just think it's really important to take a moment and think about the context, the German background that he's grown up in, and to think about what forests were and are in the German culture. And it's very rich in the fairy tale culture. That's where the Grimm's brothers wrote their books. Lots of our fairy tales of the enchanted forest come from there. The Black Forest in Germany is actually really revered in their culture as a place of enchantment and magic and beauty. And there's actually even like a fairy tale trail you can go on through the forests that kind of show where the different famous fairy tales were written and where they came from. And I'd like to suggest that some of this kind of cultural perception of forests as a character or forests as a living being kind of influences his book. And I think that's an interesting perspective to think about. And we can definitely discuss that later when we are opening up our talk to more discussion. But I'd like to just recognize that he comes from this tradition, and it's a little bit different than in our American tradition of how we have culturally looked at forests. Talk about beech trees. Germany is famous for ancient beech forests. They're protected. A lot of them are in the Black Forest. And I thought it was interesting that many of us who shared their favorite trees today did talk about beeches. And I think, Ruth, you recognize that as well. Beech trees seem to be really popular. And maybe that also harkens back to our own experiences reading fairy tales and seeing images of fairy tales. But back to Peter and his books, The Hidden Life of Trees was truly a runaway success. I think when they published it, they didn't expect it to be so successful in places like America, but it's been translated to over 30 different languages. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's spawned a lot of other books that Peter has written. And these are just a few of them that are up there. It'll be curious to hear when we are discussing if people have read any of his other books. The last book, Can You Hear the Trees, right here, is just a representative of a series of children's books that he's been working on too, that kind of really gets to the heart of what his adult books are talking about, kind of this connection that trees might be communicating or kind of living this hidden life that we didn't ever perceive. And those books for his children that he wrote for children harken to that as well. And I'll just end with this kind of ethereal picture of Peter and talk about, open up to everybody to share our own experiences reading this book and what people thought. And since there aren't that many of us, although there are a few of us, I'm hoping that we can really have a discussion and people feel comfortable sharing. So to start off with, I am really curious what people think about that idea of giving trees human emotions, like the chapter on love, or the chapter or throughout the book, kind of the idea that trees are working together to take care of each other, the way a community of humans might work together to care for each other. So let's start with that big question about anthropomorphism. And
I can start because
Thanks,
I
Trish.
had a very visceral reaction to it. I bought this book when it first came out, and I have piles of books that I'm trying to get through. I just retired, so I'm hopeful. But I was expecting a little less anthropomorphizing and a little more science. And so I have to say I was a little bit disappointed. And I think some of his anthropomorphizing got in the way of what I wanted to learn. I think about partway through, I readjusted my expectation of the book, and then that made it easier to continue through it. But initially I was taken aback by that's not what I want to know. I want to know more like overstory, or how things work together. So that was my first reaction, and now I'm sort of working through the rest.
That's great. Trish, I love that you mentioned the book Overstory, which is, you could definitely pair with this book. And that's a book of fiction by Richard Powers. And I'll include a link to that in the email that I'll send out with the recording of this, but that's a really good point. Did anybody have a similar feeling to Trish, or did anybody out there that really appreciated the breaking down of the barrier between human and trees, and thought that was really powerful for them?
I agree with Trish in that I think there's a lot of magic in nature. You know, pretty much everything that happens in anything that's living is sort of a magical thing, and it's all happening on a cellular or a molecular level, and it's controlled by biology and chemistry and physics. And I think it's a lovely thought to bring our attention to that magical stuff that happens in nature, where different organisms are working together. And I guess being a scientist, I appreciate the anthropomorphizing, but I don't really need it. I think in some cases it turns people off. And I think life is magic, you know what I mean, at any level. And that to appreciate is what we need to do. But the good thing about the book is it drew people's attention to the symbiosis that happens in life in general.
Yeah, very interesting. Anybody else want to add to that? Any thoughts? Anybody out there who really appreciate it? And Kathleen, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm just thinking of Tony, who's coming from a science perspective, and Kathleen, I know you're just a wonderful artist. I wonder as an artist, if you had a perspective that might be differing.
I thought if you look at the index in the back, there's lots of places that you can find information about things. If you read it through as a story, yes, they call a mother tree and there's family. And if you look at beeches, they always have shoots and new roots that come up. But I thought it was a pretty good book for getting information about beetles and how trees react. And then the discussion of the carbon clock, of how young trees sequester more carbon and older trees hold more carbon. So I think for a book that's a general for everybody, I thought there was a lot of good information in it. And I just suggest looking at the index for specific topics that you're interested in.
Interesting. Yeah, I spent a lot of time looking at that index too. The footnotes, I would go back and look at the footnotes. So I'm just curious, any other? So George is sharing that he had trouble with the book, especially in times like this. Science is all about the evidence. I'm just reading George's chat in case people aren't clued in. So he says science is all about evidence and truth, and science writing that divorces itself from truth and conflates the opinion with facts does grave disservice to the credibility of the science. And that is, George, you really put your finger right into the criticism of the book when it's being looked at by the scientific community. So a big question that I have is, the book has been really, really popular. I mean, it has been on the New York Times bestseller list for a while. It's been translated into all these different languages. People are really talking about it. Does it do service to the way that we perceive trees and forests, or is it a disservice to it? I'll just put that out there. Or is there something in between?
Well, I wanted to make a comment as you started saying, let's look at the roots in fantasy. So we have a long tradition, especially in Germany and forests, of the relationship of humans with another world. And there's also movies. I forget the name of the movie which had the magic tree. And so this is humans also traditionally in the non-scientific world imbuing altruism or motivation in nature. So the science, I totally agree. I understand the criticism, but from a point of view of storytelling, can scientists tell stories and make people think differently than pure hard facts? It's not a journal article. And I wonder about that aspect of his writing.
Wow, Susan, thank you. And Matt, I noticed you were going to say something. I'm curious too, knowing your background. Take it away.
Well, I would be interested to know what in particular is the criticism of his use of anthropomorphism, like what specifically. Like I certainly agree that science should be based on evidence and truth, but like the chapter on love that you pointed to, Susie, I don't see anything in that chapter, at least on my reading. I'm ready to learn, but I don't see anything in the chapter that is departing from truth. It is using the notion of agreement in an interesting way, that trees agree, and that we don't typically think about trees agreeing, but why not, And so I think we should be rigorous about what is it in particular that we think he's getting wrong, rather than saying he's anthropomorphizing, so it must be wrong. I think there's a trend these days, for the last several decades, worried about anthropomorphism, but there's a trend recently to say, well, wait a minute, Cy Montgomery, our local hero, is a great advocate for, well, we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater on anthropomorphism because we are related to all these other creatures. So of course we're going to apply human ideas to our neighbors to understand them. And why should we start from the premise that they are nothing like us at all? That seems like a prejudice. So Cy and other people have been saying, hey, wait a minute, let's bring some anthropomorphism back. That's, of course, we see with human eyes. How could we see with any other eyes, right? So I'd be interested to know, if we criticize him, that's great. I'm all for criticizing, let's do it. But I think we need to be specific. What is it that he's getting wrong exactly?
So well spoken. I was just going to bring up Cy and Carl Safina too. Really, that movement of has not looking at the world, has looking at the world purely through a scientific lens, really distance our human connection to the world. So that's the flip side. That's the yin and the yang. And as for your question about what is the science, I'll just refer Jeremy. I know we'll be talking about that more next week.
Yeah, we'll. I mean, we're not going to go through every detail in the book, but we'll go through several of the chapter story creations that are there, and then look at, well, what of this matches the sort of predominance of scientific understanding versus what's going out on a limb. Ha, good pun there.
Can I say something?
Of course, yes.
Well, I think anthropomorphism is broadly reached by science in many different ways. If there was a man named Donald Griffin who wrote The Mind of Animals quite a long time ago. He was a professor at Harvard, and he spent many years on top of beaver lodges, recording their language. And his books were very kind of pushed aside because they thought he was anthropomorphic in his studies.
Yes, Kathleen, thank you. And I'm going to just share Richard, who put in the chat, he wrote, I think anthropomorphism is one form of imagination, and scientists need imagination to push our understanding forward. And actually, I feel like what Richard is commenting on and George's chat comment about those are two sides of the coin. So it makes me want to ask the question of, why is this book so popular right now? So we are like, in a time in our life where there's this like discussion about science and truth and facts. And then we've got this big discussion, science, is that real? Or why is science, what's going on with science? And then we have kind of this this book that really talks about trees in this in a language that is not scientific, more human focused, and is reading this book. Are we drawn to this book? Is our society, is our culture drawn to this book because we are trying to come to a more of a storytelling or human understanding of science than we are experiencing right now? So I just throw that out there as a question. Why is this book so popular right now? Nancy?
I don't know whether it's pertinent to that exactly, but if you remember, I mean, remember as a child, the elms, the wonderful elms that graced almost every town. And certainly in Ohio, where I grew up, we had a public square that was full of elms, and every street was lined with elms. And it was such a disaster. And it was something that people felt internally. I mean, it wasn't just the loss of the elms, it was the loss of a kind of culture that we were used to. And it was such a shock to the system. And now we're faced with the ashes and the hemlocks and all these other trees that are diseased and going, and it makes a big difference to us because we're losing so much else.
So such a provocative and heartfelt comment, Nancy. So true. Really, is this book a book of hope? Is it just us? Is it a way to wrap our heads around hope? Rosemary?
That was going to be my comment. I think this book is so popular, particularly during this year, because it's a hopeful book. It does offer hope. It doesn't say the world is coming to an end and there's nothing we can do. And I appreciate that. And those of you who remember, what were they called? Exchanges, telephone exchanges.
Yeah.
Keene was Elmwood, and Keene was the Elm City.
Yeah.
And I am the last person to criticize anyone for anthropomorphizing, because Beatrix Potter is still my all-time heroine. Not really because of her animal stories, which I loved. I loved the fact that those were real animals. She studied so hard, and her drawings were so accurate. They just happened to be wearing clothes and acting like people. But I really think she is my heroine because of what she did for the National Trust in England. So much of the Lake District is preserved thanks to Beatrix.
So cool.
And I wish I could have voiced what I was thinking as well as Matthew did. And I loved his class at his Zoom class last year, and I'm looking forward to more.
Oh, that's so good. Yay, a shout out to Matthew, who's been a wonderful Harrisoner. I guess I will call you a presenter, a lecturer on Mary Oliver and Thoreau and Emerson, and this coming fall on the nature of poetry, nature poetry. So, and Matt, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know you have a background in kind of the ministry, and I'm so curious about your perspective on science, the kind of the mix between a book like this, which is kind of presented as science, it's the hidden life of trees, but might read more as a book that's spiritual. And I'll put that out to everybody, but I'd love to start with Matt, your perspective.
Well, I mean, my perspective is that those two things don't have to be in conflict. A lot of people think they are, but I think a lot of other people don't think they have to be in conflict at all. And I was just writing in the chat, Einstein wasn't right about everything, but he had lots of cool thoughts. And one of his thoughts was that the spiritual or religious world and the scientific world really are hand in hand, and they both come from a similar place of wonder. Another thing he said was that if you really understand a concept, a scientific concept, you don't really understand it until you're able to express it in everyday language to everyday people, and including to children even. then you really understand that concept. If you can only do it in very elite esoteric language, you don't really understand it yet. That may or may not be always true with scientific concepts, but I think it often is. And I think what Hidden Life of Trees is trying to do is put complex ideas in everyday language. And I think you do that by putting it in, recognizable shorthand, like agreement, which is what he does in the love chapter. So for me, these things all go together, the spiritual world and the scientific world and the sort of world of the complex, and then the world of communicating to everyday people. That all needs to go together.
Yeah, and I'm going to read Tony's comment in the chat because I think this gets to some of what you're saying. She said, gifted authors help bring people closer to nature, and that is a good thing. It helps people look more closely at nature. Also, the author has been so immersed in forest life that it's no surprise that he expresses his love for the forest this way. And that's definitely so true. There's nothing in this book that says that he doesn't love his work. He doesn't love trees. It vibrates with that. He just loves it. You can tell he has really studied it. And here's Matt's comment. Einstein famously said, paraphrasing, that until you can explain a scientific concept in accessible common language, you don't really understand it. So in the love chapter, the author uses the common term agree as a shorthand for the coordination of a mast year in a forest. He's communicating as widely as he can. So true. And anybody, Jeremy, it looks like, do you have something you want to say? He almost jumped out of his seat.
I did not almost jump out of my seat. I leaned forward. This is a good example just to talk about. So the term agree, I agree, we can use that as shorthand, but how do trees come about agreeing? So is it immediate communication within that growing season to determine this is going to be a huge mast year? Well, that doesn't make any sense because oaks across large regions coordinate their mast years. And we've had, what's been remarkable is 3 enormous mast years of oak in a row, which is kind of an unheard of phenomena, and what in many ways led to this enormous explosion of rodents, because mast acorns feed rodent families, and then an explosion of ticks that we all dealt with at the beginning of this summer. But that cannot be communication of tree roots, either passively or through some kinds of means communicating with one another, because we know this happens across regions where the trees are divided by topography and lakes and other water bodies. And so there has to be something else going on. And that implies that it's a climatic signal, not a communication between individuals. And if it's a climatic signal, it's a natural selection process that led to that agreement. And so I guess what concerns me about the way it's presented in this book is that it's an individual agreement versus this longer term natural selection process that has developed traits in trees where they match mast years based on climatic experiences that are going on. And that may not be a good example of where it could cause problems, but that underlying difference in how a phenomena comes about, you can imagine a situation where an interpretation that's very anthropomorphized or very simplified or just outright wrong could lead to poor policies. It could lead to a feeling of, well, we were told it was this and now it's not that. If the other explanation, for instance, natural selection in this case, proves to be the thing that's the really dominant characteristic. So I guess that was my response.
Jeremy, too, I mean, it might be good. Can you just share a little bit of your background too, just so, people know where you're coming from?
Sure. I went through college and I studied economics and environmental studies. This was back in Bowdoin College, and worked for several years for environmental consulting firms in the Boston area, and got tired of writing reports that I knew ended up on someone's bookshelf behind an EPA staff member's office somewhere, never to be looked at again. And so I really wanted to get involved in more on the ground work. And so I got interested in pursuing something in forestry and forest management. This is something I've always been interested in trees and love trees, so it matched that, but it was also lots of field work, really dealing with on the ground issues. And so I went to Yale and got a master's in forestry, and then went on to the University of Washington to get a PhD in silviculture and forest ecology. And then worked for the Forest Service for several years, and then ended up at the University of Maine teaching at their School of Forestry. I worked on landscape ecology issues. I worked on large scale forest management issues. So we were dealing with study areas that were 3 million acres in size. Something that's sort of beyond comprehension. Most of the data gathering for things like that was with satellite imagery and remote sensing of other kinds. Anyway, so I taught there for 13 years and then was looking for a next chapter in life and ended up here at the Harris Center.
So that's a perfect segue to just talk a little bit about next week when we meet again, same time, same Zoom channel. I'll send out a reminder that I'll have the Zoom link. And in that reminder, I'll also include some links to some reading about, some kind of critical reading about the book, Hidden Life of Trees, as well as a really sweet, I hope I can find it. There was a sweet conversation with Cy Montgomery and Peter Wohlleben just recently talking about looking at the world through a different perspective. And I'm hoping that I can find the link to that to share. And also, Rosemary, you reminded me, I'll send a link to the movie Mrs. Potter, which is all about Beatrix Potter. It's fictionalized, of course, but it's a wonderful movie, but it really does draw out the link that you're talking about, how she looked at the world around her and made these charming stories and how it led to the protection of lots of incredible landscape in the United Kingdom. So I'll send that. And we'll be connecting that way. And I BCC everybody usually, but in this case, I'll just put it as a CC, and that way we can share. So if other people have articles or things that they want to share, we can just have the communication and conversation continue after we finish here today. And next week, we will be taking a deeper dive with Jeremy into the chapters and looking at some of that to kind of unpack the book. Is the science behind the book accurate, or is it just pieces of the science? Did I say that right, Jeremy?
Yeah, and it's, you know, science in many respects is an understanding. So is that the truth? Well, we'll discover if it's the truth in the future, but it's our best understanding of what's going on, and there's always new discoveries made, and we'll talk about some of that as well. But it's sort of putting his chapters and observations in the context of you know, how someone from my background has been exposed to this and seen it play out over time. And again, I don't find it any less magical. And I completely agree with this sense of, well, does it really matter if it just gets people interested in the forest? And it's only in the context of, does it turn people off if they realize that it was fanciful rather than accurate? So they got interested in the forest for a reason that wasn't really accurate. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's just more important that they get interested. Anyway, lots more to talk about.
I think it's really good I'm just going to end with these last two comments. One from Tony, where she writes, what is the difference between anthropomorphizing and the marvelous complexity of nature that borders on the magical? I wonder that all the time, Tony, and I'm sure many of us here do. And does there have to be a difference? And going back to what Matt said so well is, I mean, we're humans, we're part of this world, we're animals of this world. So we see this world through our particular animal lens, and that's how other animals and other beings see the world through their own lens. So are we just, you know, does it really matter is the question, another way of saying it. And then here's George. I appreciate the imaginative stories and vision of hope offered by Wohlleben, as well as people like Ben and Phoebe Killman with bears and fantastic fungi on Netflix, and my octopus teacher, to name just a few. And I'll add my own personal new favorite is The Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrick, which is a fascinating read about mushrooms and fungi. And I want more to change the world. And George, what a great way for us to kind of end our conversation today. And it's been so good to be together like this. I know we're in our little Zoom boxes, but I hope that everybody here felt like they had a chance to speak if they wanted to, and share. And next week when we gather, we'll have more opportunity, and we'll continue the conversation kind of offline as well. So on that note,
Susie, just one thing I want to add is that it would be great to get your perspective on the history of, in a short term, and this would be next week, the history of anthropomorphication of animal behavior, because you're familiar with that, and how that played out in the wildlife.
sure. I'll get started on my PhD project as soon as we get off this call, Jeremy, and be prepared to present it next week. But I don't know if anybody has read Peter's book, The Hidden Life of Animals, which is, I haven't read yet, but I'm thinking it's probably pretty similar. And but I'm a big fan of Sai's writing, and I loved her book, The Soul of the Octopus, which got the same kind of comments that Peter's books did about it. Was it an anthropomorphizing, and was it then not valid? So, you know, I love that book. It opened my heart. I'm not ever going to eat octopus again. I did in the past, but I still have to heat my house with wood. So I'll be splitting wood during my lunch break today. On that note, thank you guys so much. And we'll see you all next week here for the next chapter in this great discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.